Imagine a booming continent where people are suddenly living, 20 years longer, gross domestic product is climbing, and hundreds of millions of people are flocking to these rapidly expanding, modernizing cities.
I mean, it sounds like an absolute economic miracle on paper.
Right. It sounds like the classic blueprint for a rising global superpower. But what if I told you that right in the middle of this massive historic boom, 85% of the children in those same cities literally can't read a basic sentence?
Which is just a staggering statistic to even try to wrap your head around.
It really is. And what if, at the exact moment, millions are moving to urban centers looking for work, the very factory jobs that built the middle class in, well, basically every other developing region are actually disappearing?
Yeah, that's the core contradiction we're looking at today.
Exactly. Today, we are unpacking an incredibly dense 15-part data narrative, a brilliantly designed academic presentation that you, our listener, sent in to us.
And I have to say, the visual design here is just, it's fantastic. You went with this highly structured, minimalist academic style that really forces the data to speak for itself.
It completely does. Your mission with this slide deck is to expose what you call the growth illusion in Sub-Saharan Africa. And just to set the baseline for our deep dive today, we are going to rely strictly on the World Bank data you provided.
Right, specifically looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, while excluding the high-income nations to get a very pure look at the developmental trajectory.
And as always, we need to be super clear with our listeners. We are looking at this purely through the lens of the data you've provided. The numbers are just the number.
Absolutely. We aren't here to take political sides or, endorse specific governmental policies or push any sort of agenda.
No, not at all. We are just going to rigorously follow the statistical trail you've laid out in these slides. So let's jump right into your cover slide, slide 1. You've got this crisp white background, and on the left, you just placed a massive red question mark.
It's a great hook. You are asking a very provocative question right out of the gate. Why is a generation that is living longer and is ostensibly wealthier facing a catastrophic learning poverty crisis?
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start exactly where your research starts, which is the macro facade, the undeniable, monumental successes.
Because if we don't acknowledge the massive progress that has been made, we really can't understand the nuance of the current crisis.
Exactly. So let's talk about life expectancy, which is your second slide.
Yeah, and the progress here is historically unprecedented. When you look at the raw historical data you pulled, the baseline starting point for life expectancy at birth in this region was roughly 41.6 years.
41. I mean, I just want to pause on that for a second because it is so easy to read a statistic like that and completely miss the human reality of it.
Oh, for sure. It's just a number on a page otherwise.
Right. But a society where the average life expectancy is 41 years old is, well, it's a society in a constant state of grief.
Yeah, it fundamentally warps the demographic pyramid. If your experienced workers, your teachers, your civic leaders are dying in their 40s, the societal brain drain is just continuous.
And it means an overwhelming number of children are growing up as orphans. It's a fundamental instability at the core of human existence.
But the data you highlighted shows this incredible, steady climb from that historical low of 41.6 all the way up to breaking 62 years of age.
And I love how you visualize this. You just used a simple red dashed line to circle the starting point and the end point with this big, thick upward arrow highlighting the plus 20 years.
It's very effective. I mean, an addition of 20 full years of human life, on average across an entire subcontinent, is a monumental victory for global public health.
So what is actually driving that? Because gaining 2 decades of life expectancy doesn't just happen by accident. Right?
No, not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this jump is the triumph of concerted, highly targeted interventions.
Like vaccines and things like that.
Exactly. Massive global and local vaccine rollouts, the widespread distribution of insecticide-treated bed nets to combat malaria, improved sanitation infrastructure, and just huge breakthroughs in infectious disease control.
Especially regarding childhood mortality, I'd imagine.
Spot on. When you drastically reduce the number of children dying before their 5th birthday, the statistical average for life expectancy just shoots upward.
So we have this massive explosion of human survival. People are living longer, kids are surviving infancy. But survival is really just step 1.
Right, because all these living, breathing, aspiring people have to go somewhere.
And your third slide points out exactly where they're going. They are leaving the countryside.
This is the demographic shift that changes the world. You use this really stark area chart with contrasting light and dark gray to track the rural population as a percentage of the total.
And the visual drop is intense. You put a downward arrow right where the trend is steepest.
Yeah, historically the region was overwhelmingly agrarian. Up near 85% of the population lived in rural areas, mostly engaging in subsistence farming. But that number dropped steeply down to roughly 54% in recent years.
That is hundreds of millions of people packing up and moving to cities. It's like watching a time lapse of a city skyline just exploding upward.
And you added a great text box there, noting that this shift creates an unprecedented pressure cooker for infrastructure and employment.
Which brings up a huge question. When I think of urbanization, my mind immediately goes to the Industrial Revolution in Europe or, maybe China over the last 40 years.
Right, the classic models.
Yeah. When millions of people moved from the farms to the cities in England or Shenzhen, they completely changed the global economy. Why should our listener care about this specific demographic shift in Sub-Saharan Africa? Is it just the same story playing out again?
Well, that is exactly the assumption most traditional economic models make. And it's exactly the assumption your data completely dismantles.
Oh, wow. How so?
Historically, demographic shifts of this magnitude dictate global economic pivots. You move from the farm to the city, you get a job in a factory, productivity skyrockets, and the whole nation gets wealthier.
But that only happens if the structural foundation is actually ready to absorb those people, right?
Exactly. Moving hundreds of millions of people to urban centers creates massive strain. You need housing, you need sanitation, you need transit, but above all, you need jobs.
Which leads us perfectly into the second major phase of your research on slide 4, the structural missing link. We've got the people, we've got the cities, but what are they actually doing all day?
This is where the growth illusion stops being a theory and becomes a mathematical reality. You compile data on the value added to GDP by different economic sectors using a stacked bar chart.
I noticed you specifically used a dark highlight for the manufacturing slice to make it pop against the gray.
Yeah, and the numbers here are completely counterintuitive. In a booming urbanizing region, you would expect manufacturing to be the engine of growth. But the data shows manufacturing value added is totally stagnating.
It's just hovering between 10 and 11% of GDP, right? And in some recent years, it's actually trending downward.
Exactly. It's premature deindustrialization.
Wait, hold on. Let me play devil's advocate here. Isn't the whole point of the 21st century economy that we are moving past manufacturing?
That's a very common argument.
Like, why do we even need massive factories? Can't a developing nation just leapfrog the dirty, smog-filled industrial phase and go straight into the service economy? Why is a lack of manufacturing such a red flag?
It's a fantastic question, and it's a trap a lot of modern economists fall into. While it sounds nice in theory to jump straight to a clean, service-based economy, in practice, it removes the most vital stepping stone for poverty alleviation in human history.
Okay, unpack that for me. What does a factory do for a society that a service job doesn't?
Think about the nature of the labor. When a subsistence farmer moves to the city, they typically lack formal education. They don't have high-level literacy or numeracy skills.
Right, they can't just walk into a bank and become a financial analyst.
Exactly. Historically, manufacturing has been the great absorber of low-skilled labor. A factory takes someone who has only ever known the cyclical life of a farm, and it teaches them the discipline of the clock.
It teaches basic technical skills and teamwork.
And more importantly, it provides a highly predictable, steady wage. That steady wage allows them to feed their children, pay for health care, and send the next generation to school.
Ah, I see. It's an economic escalator. You work on the assembly line so your kids can get the education required to work in an office.
Precisely. Manufacturing builds the middle class. But the data here shows that Sub-Saharan Africa is bypassing that phase almost entirely.
Why is it bypassing it, though? If there is all this cheap, available labor flooding into the cities, why aren't multinational corporations building factories on every corner?
Because the global economic landscape has fundamentally changed. When East Asia industrialized, they had a unique window. Today, a new factory in Sub-Saharan Africa has to compete directly with highly optimized, massively scaled supply chains in places like China or Vietnam.
And I imagine automation plays a huge role now, too.
Huge. Modern manufacturing is increasingly automated. You don't need 10,000 workers to run a modern textile plant anymore. You need 500 highly skilled technicians and a row of robots.
So the ladder has effectively been pulled up.
To a large extent, yes. The GDP in the region is still growing, which creates the illusion of a boom. But that growth is largely driven by the export of raw commodities like minerals and oil, which don't actually employ many people.
Okay, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of a 22-year-old who just moved from a rural village to a massive city like Lagos or Nairobi. There are no factory jobs waiting. So what do?
They are forced into the informal service sector. They hustle to survive.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if the economy is skipping manufacturing and moving straight towards services, well, a service-based economy relies on one foundational pillar, the human mind.
You need education.
Exactly. You can't run a service economy on manual labor. You need literacy, basic math, problem-solving skills. And that brings us to slide 5, the start of what you call the education paradox.
The contrast you've drawn in this section of the data is brilliant because you start by highlighting what appears to be a massive administrative victory. You tracked primary school completion rates.
Yeah, using this really clean step-line chart, you put solid dots at the key years where the rate broke 65%.
And the logistical achievement here is undeniable. The data shows a steady, impressive rise in primary school completion, climbing from historically under 46% to nearly 70% in recent years.
Which is huge. More kids are sitting in classrooms than ever before in the region's history.
We absolutely have to give credit where it's due. Building the physical schools, eliminating prohibitive school fees, organizing the logistics of teachers, getting 70% of the youth to complete primary school is a monumental feat.
It's like building thousands of state-of-the-art hospitals, getting all the patients inside, but... And here is the tragedy of slide 6, having absolutely no medicine.
That's a perfect analogy, because more kids are in seats, but the cognitive development, the actual learning, is leaking out of the system.
Your 6th slide uses an icon array, and it is devastating. You show 10 little children icons, and 8.5 of them are shaded gray.
Right, to represent the learning poverty rate.
You put a red box around the specific statistic. 85.6% of children at the primary school graduation age are reading below the minimum proficiency level.
This raises an incredibly important question about the difference between schooling and learning. We've spent decades measuring success by counting seats filled. But a seat filled means nothing if cognitive development isn't happening.
I just want to make sure I'm fully grasping this. We aren't talking about them failing advanced calculus, right?
No, not at all. The World Bank defines learning poverty as being unable to read and understand a simple text by age 10.
Wow. So basic foundational literacy.
Correct. When 85% of your primary school graduates cannot do this, you don't really have an education system. You have a highly expensive daycare system. It is a massive leakage of human capital.
Why is this happening? If the kids are in the room and the teacher's in the room, why isn't the learning happening?
Because expanding access is fundamentally a logistical challenge. But improving quality is a complex, systemic challenge. Let's look at the reality of these classrooms. You might have 80 or 100 kids crammed into a single room.
That's impossible to manage.
And the teacher might be underpaid, undertrained, or severely demoralized, leading to massive rates of teacher absenteeism.
Right. If the teacher has to work a second job in the informal market just to feed their own family, they aren't going to be giving their all in the classroom.
Exactly. Furthermore, you have the issue of language. Many of these children speak a local indigenous dialect at home, but are forced to learn in English, French, or Portuguese.
That adds a massive cognitive barrier right out of the gate.
And perhaps most critically, you have the hidden specter of early childhood malnutrition.
I'm glad you brought that up because we really can't ignore the biology of learning.
We absolutely cannot. If a child experiences severe nutritional deficits in the first 1,000 days of life, their brain architecture is physically altered. They suffer from stunting.
So even if they are sitting in a modern classroom with a great teacher, their neurological capacity to focus and retain memory is already compromised.
Yes. So you have this perfect storm. Overcrowded rooms, language barriers, under-resourced teachers, and physically stunted children.
And the data shows the immediate brutal consequence of this on slide 7. You mapped out the transition from primary school to lower secondary school using a dumbbell plot.
And the numbers just fall off a cliff. We go from that near 70% primary completion rate down to a lower secondary completion rate that hovers desperately between 22 and 45%.
Over half the kids just vanish from the system.
And logically, why wouldn't they? If you have spent 6 years in primary school and you still can't read the basic textbooks, how can you possibly survive the secondary school curriculum?
Right, which demands independent reading and complex math. They hit a cognitive wall and drop out. And your dumbbell plot specifically highlights a massive structural inequality buried inside that dropout rate, the gender gap.
Yes, you put a two-way arrow right between the male and female data points to show how much worse the retention of girls is at this age.
Why does the system fail young women so disproportionately right at this specific transition?
When primary education fails to impart basic skills, families have to make harsh economic choices. If a family has limited funds for secondary school fees or uniforms, and neither the son nor the daughter is excelling academically, cultural biases take over.
They prioritize the boy's education.
Exactly. And for girls, reaching secondary school age introduces a host of compounded social factors. The threat of early marriage, teenage pregnancy, a lack of menstrual hygiene facilities in rural schools, and safety concerns when traveling long distances.
So the human capital of nearly half the population is being structurally neutralized before they even turn 15.
It is incredibly grim.
So let's zoom out and look at the whole board. We've got a booming youth population moving to urban centers. The traditional factory jobs don't exist, and they can't get knowledge economy jobs because the education system has failed them. Where do they go?
This brings us to slide 8, the cruel job market. This is where macroeconomic theory crashes headfirst into daily human survival.
You used a donut chart here, and it is devastating. You used a deep color for over 2/3 of the ring to represent the workforce trapped in vulnerable employment.
The numbers are staggering. We are talking about 69 to 72.5% of the total workforce, 7 out of 10 workers.
To truly understand that, we need to define what vulnerable employment actually means in this World Bank data, right?
Yes. This isn't just someone working a part-time job or doing freelance web design. It is defined as the sum of contributing family workers and own account workers.
Translated into plain English, what does that look like on the street?
It looks like individuals who have absolutely no formal salary arrangement, no health insurance, no pension, and no governmental safety net. It is the woman selling loose vegetables on a blanket by the side of a busy intersection.
Or the young guy navigating a battered motorbike acting as an unofficial taxi.
Precisely. It's the child helping their uncle sort through scrap metal. It is the absolute definition of precarious living.
It's a hustle economy where you literally eat what you kill that day.
And if they sprain an ankle and can't walk to the market for a week, their family does not eat. There is no paid sick leave. When you combine the lack of manufacturing with the failure of the education system, this massive, sprawling, informal economy is the default result.
The urban youth boom isn't becoming a unified workforce. It is being absorbed entirely by a fragmented survival economy. And what makes this even more challenging is that they are trying to execute this hustle in an environment that lacks basic infrastructure.
Which is what you illustrate beautifully on slide 9, the grid.
Yeah, you used a super minimalist horizontal bar chart here. You drew a dashed line to represent the 100% goal and a horizontal arrow showing the massive gap. Urban electricity access is stuck between 62 and 72%.
That means roughly a third of the people living in these booming, supposedly modernizing cities do not have reliable power, and that's just in the cities.
Right, the rural numbers are obviously much worse. But staying focused on the urban centers, how do you possibly climb out of poverty if you can't even turn the lights on?
You generally can't. Electricity is the hard ceiling on economic productivity. Let's take that woman selling vegetables on the street corner. If she wants to become a formal small business owner, what does she need?
She needs a refrigerator to keep her produce from rotting.
She needs lights to keep her store open after sunset. She needs to charge a mobile phone to coordinate with suppliers. Without power, her business can never scale. She is permanently locked at the subsistence level.
So the lack of an energy grid basically acts as an invisible cage around the region's entrepreneurial potential.
Exactly. You cannot build a modern service economy without reliable electricity.
And if they don't have basic electricity, they definitely don't have the digital infrastructure required to compete globally. Which brings us to slide 10. You plotted the number of secure internet servers per 1 million people.
The absolute values you found of the World Bank database here are so incredibly low, often just in the tens or hundreds of servers per million people, that they barely register on a global scale.
You added a great text box pointing out how tiny these numbers are. I mean, if we compare that to North America, where the numbers are in the hundreds of thousands, it's a completely different universe.
Oh, absolutely.
But why does a street vendor care about secure internet servers? Isn't that just a metric for tech startups?
Not anymore. Secure servers are the backbone of the entire modern global economy. They are what allow for secure digital banking, encrypted communications, and international e-commerce.
So if you want local tech startups to build apps that solve local logistical problems, you need server infrastructure.
Precisely. What's fascinating here is how these data points interact to form a trap. The global economy is transitioning to high-value digital services,
Yep.
but you cannot leapfrog into the global digital economy without secure servers.
And you can't run servers without a reliable electricity grid.
And you cannot build a reliable grid without a highly educated workforce and massive capital investment, which you don't have because of learning poverty and a lack of manufacturing.
It is just a cascading failure of structural transitions. They are locked out of the global digital market before they even get a chance to log on.
And this brings us to a crucial turning point in your analysis. Section 5, Slide 11, the hidden human toll.
This is where we really start to look beneath the hood of the growth illusion, because up until now, someone could argue, well, sure, things are tough, but GDP is still technically growing, right?
But your data forces us to look at the underlying erosion of the region's human and environmental capital. You used a dual-axis line chart to track the incidence of tuberculosis and HIV infection rates.
You put downward arrows to show the rates are dropping, which is great, but you also use this red shading to emphasize the absolute baseline of these diseases.
Exactly. A decreasing crisis is still a crisis. When millions of people in their prime working years are managing chronic conditions like HIV or surviving bouts of TB, the economic drag is immense.
It means lost workdays and depleted family savings, right?
Yes, and a generalized physical fatigue that drastically limits labor productivity.
And you make this human toll even more stark when you pivot to maternal mortality on slide 12. You created this powerful infographic with 4 female silhouettes, and you colored one of them red.
It is arguably the most critical indicator of a healthcare system's actual functionality. The data notes that while the maternal mortality rate has drastically improved from historical highs, where it was a horrifying 1 in 15 lifetime risk, the current numbers remain distressingly poor.
The data shows it still sits at roughly a 1 in 4 lifetime risk of maternal death, 1 in 4.
I want the listener to really internalize that. How does a statistic like that fundamentally alter an economy? It is a profound health crisis that quietly but ruthlessly taxes the economic future of the region. Let's trace the ripple effect. When a mother dies or is severely disabled by childbirth complications, the immediate family is thrown into chaos.
The surviving children are significantly more likely to drop out of school, aren't they?
Exactly. They drop out to help manage the household or work in the informal economy. The nutritional status of the surviving infants plummets, leading to the cognitive stunting we discussed earlier.
So it perpetuates the cycle of poverty instantly across a whole new generation. Traditional GDP doesn't capture the economic void left by a mother's death at all.
It only measures the financial transactions that happen afterward, which is the perfect segue to slide 13, what I think is the most clarifying concept in your entire presentation.
Adjusted net savings. You built a waterfall chart here that is just brilliant.
Yes, adjusted net savings, or ANS, is a true measure of sustainable wealth creation. It fixes the blind spot of traditional GDP.
Break the math down for me, because this completely changed how I look at economic growth.
Traditionally, if a country cuts down a massive, ancient forest and sells the timber, their GDP goes up. They look economically healthy on paper.
But in reality, they just liquidated an irreplaceable natural asset.
Exactly. ANS starts with gross national saving, but then it subtracts the depletion of natural resources. You show this visually with these downward red negative bars on the waterfall chart.
And it subtracts health damages too, right?
Yes, the hidden costs of pollution damage, specifically the health impacts of particulate emissions in these booming cities. Finally, it adds back in education expenditures as an investment in human capital.
So if I'm trying to come up with an analogy for this, it's like a family that is celebrating a massive raise at work. On paper, their income looks amazing, but to pay for their flashy new lifestyle, they're secretly selling off the family's antique furniture.
And on top of that, because they live in a toxic environment, half the family is chronically sick, so exorbitant medical bills are eating whatever's left of the raise.
That's exactly it. The top-line GDP looks great, but their actual accumulated wealth for the future, their net worth, is zero or even negative.
And when you run the numbers for Sub-Saharan Africa using the ANS metric, the illusion is mathematically proven. The region is effectively liquidating its natural capital and burning out its human capital to produce a temporary, unsustainable bump in GDP.
Which prevents any real generational wealth accumulation. It's like running fast just to stay in the exact same place.
Exactly. And this brings us to the climax of your data presentation on slide 14, the grand synthesis.
You pull all these disparate threads into a single radar chart or spider chart, and the shape of it is completely extreme.
You mapped out four major dimensions: life expectancy, school enrollment, learning quality, and formal employment. And when you plot these out, the system is fundamentally lopsided.
The metrics for quantity, how long people live and how many kids are enrolled, are stretching way outward. But the metrics for quality actual learning and access to formal jobs are sunken deeply inward. You actually drew circles around the sunken parts to emphasize the shortfall.
It totally disrupts the narrative we always hear about the demographic dividend.
Right. For years, economists have looked at aging populations in Europe and Japan, and they point to Sub-Saharan Africa's youth boom as the inevitable future workforce of the 21st century.
The theory assumes that a massive influx of young people will naturally drive a historic economic boom. But your presentation forcefully argues that a demographic dividend is never automatic. It is highly conditional.
If you have millions of youths, but they have an 85% learning poverty rate and no formal jobs to transition into, you do not get an economic dividend.
You get what you termed a human capital deficit. If those two massive gaps aren't urgently fixed, this youth boom will mutate into a destabilizing social burden.
It's a terrifying prospect. Vast urban centers filled with young people surviving day to day without a safety net, fully able to see the global economy on their smartphones, but structurally locked out of it.
Which is why your conclusion on slide 15 is so vital. You outline a massive policy shift.
You use a really clean three-column layout here, acknowledging the achievements in lifespan, facing the crisis of learning poverty, and demanding a shift in policy.
A paradigm shift from quantity to quality. For the last 50 years, global development policy has been driven by counting things, counting schools built, counting kids enrolled, but your data proves that phase is over.
Now, the policy must shift to the internal structure of the economy and the quality of the human mind, reimagining how to bring manufacturing back or investing in actual cognitive development.
You end with this incredibly powerful thought at the bottom of the slide. Behind the digital growth, there must be substantive human development. It is a masterclass in using the World Bank's own metrics to completely dismantle and rebuild the traditional narrative.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final lingering thought. We've seen how the traditional 20th century blueprints building legacy schools focused on rote memorization and waiting around for foreign manufacturing jobs are simply not scaling fast enough.
The old ladder is definitively broken.
But what if we are looking at this the wrong way? What if the lack of legacy industrial infrastructure is actually a blank slate?
That is a deeply fascinating premise.
Right. Think about how the region completely leapfrogged traditional banking with mobile money. They skipped the 20th century banking model entirely. What if the solution for Sub-Saharan Africa is to invent a completely new, digitally decentralized way of learning and working that the rest of the world hasn't even thought of yet?
You're talking about a leapfrog event, not just in consumer technology, but in human capital deployment itself.
Exactly. What if the schools of the future there look nothing like Western schools? It's a massive what if. But when the old blueprint is failing 85% of your kids, you have to draw a new one.
It will require unimaginable innovation, but your data suggests it might be the only viable path forward.
We want to genuinely thank you for bringing such a rigorously academic and deeply thought-provoking presentation to our table today. Keep questioning those numbers, and never forget that when you look at macroeconomics, you always have to look beneath the surface.